Hi guys, and welcome to History 240 again. Sorry that this is just a little bit late. It turns out, has been probably the busiest week of this semester. And as it turns out, it's probably the busiest week that it's going to be in the entire semester. So hopefully we won't have any more days where the lecture is late. But luckily we've just got a short lecture today. It's only about 6 slides, I think, so we should get through it pretty quickly. So let's go ahead and get started talking about emancipation and Reconstruction, so post-Civil War era. And we're going to kind of tiptoe this line back and forth over the next week or two, kind of going from post-Civil War, just directly after the Civil War, all the way to the 1900s. And we're kind of going to go back and forth talking about culture. We're going to go into art a little bit. We're going to talk about major political developments, things like that. All of that is going to be covered over the next couple of weeks. And that's really going to be where the majority of your next test comes from, is from this little bit of time between Reconstruction, the Civil War, and the 1900s, early 1900s. We probably won't get to any farther than World War II in this. So we're covering approximately 100 years here. So let's go ahead and get started with emancipation. So emancipation, as you all well know, is what we call the time when we freed the slaves. So by this time, and within the Civil War, slaves are flocking to the Union armies by the summer of 1862, so really in the height of the Civil War. And slaves are going in, and they're going from their plantations, from the places where they're being held, and they're going into these Union camps. Now, they're staying separated from the Union Army, but they're still being compounded with the Union Army. So there's still segregation within the Union Army at this point. But it really debunks this myth of the slaves being content in their bondage, having this idea that slaves are happy being slaves and that they're perfectly content. Well, the fact that they're flocking to these Union armies completely dismantles that whole idea and really brings to light some of the atrocities that, people were protesting against within suffrage movements and within civil rights movements and things along those lines, emancipationists throughout the last probably 25 years or so. And as you can see in the picture that you've got here, this is a slave who's been whipped several times, and that was usually the punishment for running away. So it appears that this man has run away several times based on his scarring. But, it really brings to light this question of, can they really be content if this is what they're experiencing? So the Emancipation Proclamation that's given by Abraham Lincoln frees approximately 3 million slaves in the Confederate States, but only in the Confederate States. There are still approximately 180,000 in the Union Army. And so it's not until the end of the Civil War and starting into Reconstruction that we see all slaves freed. So in the end, it brings to question, is there still a revolution of the South? How are we going to bring the South back into the United States? How are we going to really make them part of the Union again? How are we going to end this Civil War without completely obliterating the South? How are we going to do it without, wrecking them financially? How are we going to do it without completely turning over everything that the South is built on? Because the South is essentially built on slave labor. How are they going to return the Confederate States to the Union without, damaging them politically? Because this entire time, Lincoln has continued to state that the South is still part of the Union. They're still part of the United States. But the Confederate States under their own separate government, they see themselves as politically different. So Lincoln's really pondering this question when he's killed on April 14th in 65. And this is about the time that Andrew Johnson takes over. So when Johnson enters, his plans reflect the desires of Abraham Lincoln, and it reflects Lincoln's ideas of both unionism and the Confederate idea of states' rights, both together, which is a really tricky way to do things. So, according to Johnston, states do have the right to govern themselves. The federal government has no right to determine voting requirements. So, those who are poor, those who are African American, women, they can still not have any voting rights at this point. But they don't have any right to govern questions of state. So the state on a national level. Oh, and my daughter's in here. Hold on just a second, guys.
Mother,
What's up?
I finished my cereal.
Okay, go ahead and
Can you help me get some more?
just a second, I can, okay? Can you go ahead and brush your teeth so that we're ready to go?
I'm still hungry.
Okay. I'll get you some here in just a minute, okay? Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so let's keep going. So, in action, what Johnson's plan does is he takes all the confiscated land that was taken by the Union during the Civil War, which is essentially slave land. It's land that slaves have worked for the last couple centuries, and he distributes it back to slaves by putting together the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, and he makes this land into specifically slave-owned land, or he'll return it to its former owners, depending on where their allegiances were. But the Freedmen's Bureau is essentially established to assist refugees and freed slaves. And so beyond that, he ratifies the 13th Amendment. The Confederate generals and Confederate soldiers have to swear loyalty to the Union. He forces the South to repay the war debt, which is fairly substantial and, really puts the South in a bind for a long time. And then he gives Southern states essentially free reign to rebuild after that. So if you look over here in the corner at the map where you've got essentially a picture of the United States that's got green and blue and pink on it. What this is showing is where slaves and the 14th and 13th Amendment have been ratified and at what times they've been ratified. So all of the blue states show that the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1865. The green shows that they were ratified between 1865 and 1870. And then you've got purple, which ratifies it somewhere between 1866 and 1995. And the gray states are not states at this time. But you'll notice that some of these states don't ratify the 14th Amendment for a very, very long time. So Delaware doesn't ratify it until 1901, Kentucky 1976, and then Mississippi in 1995 under their state constitutions. Kentucky sees this as an oversight. Politically, and within their state state issues, but it really doesn't seem like it's just an oversight to me from everything that I've read. But I will leave that up to you guys to decide and kind of look into. So, and let you guys, kind of formulate your own opinions on this. So let's talk about the legacy of states having to repay and the southern states coming back into the Union after this. So right directly after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, immediately post-Civil War, we see the installation of things called black codes. And these are restrictions of free black men and their rights. And it kind of reaffirms them as sources of cheap labor. So, it keeps them within their social standing, and doesn't allow them to have a whole lot of mobility, either economically, politically, anything like that. And this really, really upsets Northern statesmen. And so they do their best to kind of keep those black codes out of Congress. And actually, at one point, they will even sit down and they'll say, "I'm sorry, you can't come into any of these federal buildings and make laws today because, oh, sorry, you support black codes." Things that the North has been fighting for the last couple of years, and abolitionists have been moving towards for several years now. They're essentially changing the name and putting them back in place through these black codes. So in 1866, we'll see an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Bill, which states that if you're born in the United States, then you are a national citizen with equal rights, no matter what your race, what your color, what your creed, doesn't matter. If you're born here, you're one of us. And this bill is vetoed by Johnson, and it essentially ends his relationship with Congress. From this point forward, he cannot function alongside Congress. And they actually attempt to impeach him specifically because of his vetoing of the Civil Rights Bill. So you can see that there's still a giant political divide despite the fact that the Civil War is over. But in any case, in 1868, it becomes the first bill to become law despite presidential veto. Now, with this impeachment, kind of over to the side here, I've included a little bit about the points that Congress brings up when they attempt to impeach him. And most of it kind of centers around this fella, Edward Stanton. And it's essentially because he was terminated that they use this as a stepping stone to kind of say that Johnson is a poor president, or he makes poor decisions, or he doesn't have the best interest of the United States, in mind when he does this. So going on from this, in 1867, under the Reconstruction Act, he divides the South into 5 military districts, and he outlines male suffrage within these military districts and says, okay, this is where the lines of voting run and how they run. And it also stipulates that the South must ratify the 14th Amendment to qualify to come back into the Union. So it expands citizenship to former slaves, and it gives them equal protection under the law. And then just 2 years after that, we have the 15th Amendment that says that you cannot be denied the right to vote based on your race, your color, or the fact that you were formerly a slave. And by 1870, all states are readmitted to the Union. And I think a lot of the reason why Kentucky and Delaware don't ratify this amendment until much later in history is because they never left the Union. So they didn't necessarily have to include this in their state constitution to be able to qualify to come back into the Union. Other benefits of Johnson and his legacy is that you start seeing, hi Pookie, please stop. You start seeing state-funded public schools, tax legislation that takes into mind where your political and economic standpoints are. Generally economic more than political, though. There are laws against discrimination, and they also develop programs for railroads and other major industries and make things easier for them to be able to get business. All right, so moving on from there, we're going to talk about race and feuds for just a minute. Now, with this, we're strictly talking about political feuding. We'll get into the Hatfield-McCoy issue a little later on in the semester. So with the end of Reconstruction, you see a rise of the KKK, and you can see a picture of the KKK right over here in the corner. And what this is it targets Republican leaders and challenges their authority. So um, essentially what's going on here is the KKK is really taking a look at all of the unwanted people in their society, and this is predominantly in the South. And it essentially tries to remove them from society in one way, shape, or another. So, it's not only Black people who are being targeted by the KKK in the beginning. It includes Southern whites who approved of Northern Republican Reconstruction, and it gives them the term scallywags. It also targets carpetbaggers, who are Northerners who come south to profit from the devastation of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and these people are often Republican too, and freed blacks. And this eventually will lead to Republicans becoming conservative over the 70s. So in 1874, we see a giant economic depression. So if you think about the way that economics work, if you're funneling money into the government through war, and then all of a sudden it stops, then you're going to have an economic depression that follows generally. So the Democratic Party will win the House of Representatives, and it'll be the first time since the Civil War. And we'll see Democratic violence in this campaign, especially in Missouri, and